Cool. So we're going to go through a potpourri of kind of global activities around ASF, prevention, response, control. And so these are a few of the topics I'll like to discuss. We won't get into deep depth on any of them because we have 20 minutes, but feel free to jump in with any questions. First thing I wanted to mention is OIE, which I'm old enough that I have a lot of trouble saying World Organization for Animal Health. It was formerly the OIE. And the mission of OIE, or WOA, I will eventually get there, is to improve animal health globally and thereby ensure a better future for all. And they do that through development of many items, but they do international standard setting. So there's a whole standard setting process. There's 185 member countries that are involved in the process, some more than the others. But every one of those countries has the option or opportunity to express opinions, to offer up experts for expert working groups, et cetera. And the standards don't have a lot of teeth. There is no WOA policeman saying every country needs to follow these standards and auditing them. But where the teeth come in, or the ability to perhaps enforce those standards is if there's ever a World Trade Organization dispute, they will look at the appropriate international standards. For food safety, that might be Codex. For animal health, it would be WOA. Now, got to say there aren't a whole lot of WTO cases that go through the whole process, but it is that threat in the background that people should follow WOA standards. So there's a whole bunch of WOA standards, and they've got two main ones that we use, but there is the Terrestrial Animal Health Code that deals largely with animal health and some general principles. Same for aquatic animals. And then there's also the Manual of Diagnostic Tests and Vaccines for terrestrial animals, and that's where you get into diagnostic tests, and they get into great depth, like what your dilutions of certain reagents should be, how long you should let them incubate, et cetera, and as well as with vaccines, things like how many passages you should take to look at reversion to virulence, what cell line cultures you should use, et cetera. And they have another Manual of Diagnostic Tests for aquatic animals. They do update those regularly. Every 5 years, each one of the chapters comes back for review, but you can open a chapter at any time and ask for changes. It's difficult. It is lengthy. A chapter can take years to pass. And as a North American, I am very resentful that the Europeans get 27 votes and the US gets 1. And so it is also very Eurocentric. So it takes a lot of negotiation, a lot of sometimes threatening to throw a fit, whatever, before you get a lot accomplished. So WOA issues official country standards or status for the following diseases. So FMD, African horse sickness, CSF, contagious bovine pleuropneumonia, PPR, then they issue a BSE risk status, and they'll endorse official control programs for bovine pleuropneumonia, FMD, PPR, and dog-mediated rabies. What's one of the things missing from that list is ASF. So nowhere does WOA issue a status that says this country is free of ASF, this country is positive, this region of this country is free. So member countries are required to report outbreaks. So every day I get an update from their database that says here's the outbreaks reported for the various diseases. But WOA does not go back and say that outbreak has ended, that this country is now free, this region is free. Countries can self-declare, and they submit a dossier to WOA that says here's why we have self-declared. But WOA does not approve that status as freedom. They will approve that the dossier contains the required information that trading partner countries could look at and make determination on whether they believe that. So the US had never had anything to do with ASF. We've never had it in the country. So as we set up the protection zone in Puerto Rico, the US had to make a declaration, put up a dossier on the WOA website that says we are historically free of ASF. We do X number of ASF tests every year. We do X number of foreign animal disease investigations, and thus we can credibly say we are historically free. There's several different places in the standards where that are appropriate or pertinent to ASF. There is a Chapter 15 in the Terrestrial Animal Health Code that deals with ASF specifically. And then Chapter 4 is kind of their catch-all, but it is very pertinent in some cases. In many cases, there's chapters on, or sections in Chapter 4 on disease prevention, identification, traceability, zoning, regionalization, compartmentalization, disposal of dead animals, disinfection, and vaccination. So all of those are general principles, but can be applied to African swine fever. Terrestrial Animal Code Section 5 talks about trade measures, and then the Terrestrial Manual, which is the section on diagnostics, including lab management and vaccine development. This spring at the Paris meeting that is their general session, they did have a draft chapter on ASF vaccination. It was heavily commented on, and they were unable to reach a consensus, so it has been pulled back. We'll be going back through the scientific commission, and the expectation is it will come forward for next year, and that's going to be extremely helpful. We'll talk about a little bit of the situation when we get to the vaccine discussion. So kind of in summary, there are both general and specific standards that can be applied to ASF control and response. Trading partners can choose to apply requirements that are more stringent than WOA standards. So as we have gotten into trade discussions with some of our trading partners, particularly in the Southeast Hemisphere, we have had some issues where they have applied standards that are more strict than what WOA would be. But there is a little caveat within the WOA Terrestrial Animal Health Code that said you have the ability to make measures that are more strict. If you do, you should base those on risk analysis conducted in accordance with WOA Chapter 2.1. That doesn't always happen, but it is that caveat. The trading partners can choose to adopt stricter standards than what the WOA standards are. The other thing that is kind of here a catch-all bucket I wanted to touch is kind of that incentives around ASF, or for making strategy decisions around ASF. So I've been working on a project this year, got to be involved with countries around the globe, and realize that we don't all have the same objectives. And there are different incentives for control of ASF in different countries. So the situation within a country will have significant influence on ASF response strategies. So wild pigs versus domestic pigs, where is the outbreak? In Europe, it is an outbreak driven by wild boar with overflow into the domestic population, whereas in Asia, we often see it the other way, where it's a domestic pig problem. In Africa, you've got the African wild pigs that really don't get sick, or largely don't get sick. They aren't really good at transmitting disease, but they do serve as a reservoir for the ticks. And so there's the whole epidemiology that will affect what is, or will influence what is an effective control strategy. Veterinary services infrastructure, you look at, we have a decent one. When I went to Poland the first time and talked about their ASF response, Poland is a country the size of Ohio. They had more government veterinarians in Poland than we have in the entire United States. And so veterinary services infrastructure is incredible. And then you get to Africa, where they may not have the veterinary infrastructure needed to have any control program. Food security, and actually I would say poverty within a country, is a very important consideration. We look at depopulation of entire sites, whereas I was at a recent meeting where we had an African nation represented that said they felt depopulation of sites was unethical, unsustainable, immoral, and inhumane. And so it makes you kind of think, for us that are trade-oriented, that is where we want to go or where we feel we need to go. But if you're in a country that is food insecure, is it wasteful to the point where it's unethical? And so I think that also drives response. The pig industry infrastructure, as I was working on this project that got me talking with other countries, you realize that not everybody has what we have. We sit in the United States with a very robust commercial industry. And it's probably unusual in a lot of the world. Probably more of the world has a less of a commercial industry as dominating as we are within the United States. And so what do those shareholders or stakeholders have? And it could be smallholders, it could be backyard, it could be commercial pigs, but do we have animal ID, traceability, confinement? Can we put in biosecurity into place depending on the infrastructure of the industry? And is that industry focused on international trade? Because I would say that if we weren't trading so much, we might have a much different priority around African swine fever than we do now. And just a couple examples of different strategies. So we mentioned the European wild boar outbreaks. They've done a good job in some countries, such as Belgium and the Czech Republic, of fencing around wild boar outbreaks that are small and discrete, depopulating the wild boars within those areas and becoming free. It's been more difficult to control wild boar and large outbreaks, and so the most effective strategies may have been biosecurity. Just heard talk by the CBO of Germany last week, where they're now doing double fencing and putting between the fences what they call white zones. So any pig that gets between the fences will be depopulated, but those on the positive side of the fence, they're not as worried about depopulating. They're controlling that white zone between the free area here and the infected area there. I had the privilege to go to Denmark and look at the fence they are building between Denmark and Germany. They can do it. The border is less than 70 kilometers long. And they had very few wild boar to begin with in Denmark, fenced off Germany, killed all the pigs in Denmark. And this is my very favorite example of how the Danes are. I had one of them tell me one time, we have approximately 32 wild boar left in Denmark. It's not 30, 50, 100, 32. So, and this was the border fence. It was a pretty expensive, but for them, worthwhile venture. And this is also supplemented by truck washes of trucks washing the borders, animal movement reporting, et cetera. So then you get to Africa, you have your warthogs, your bush pigs, your Red River hogs that are immune to clinical disease, little spillover in domestic populations. So controlling ASF and the wild pig population in Africa doesn't make a lot of sense. And as we mentioned before, depopulation of infected sites may compromise food security. Haiti and the Dominican Republic, I know Sylvia Crendel and crew will be talking shortly, so I won't get into it a lot. But really, you look at the situation in Haiti with poverty and political unrest been a major disincentive to take action. And the challenges within the DR between having a robust enough, competent veterinary authority, their instant management team, which I think she'll get into more. They don't export pork. They had regulations. Sometimes they needed to make regulations, and then the ability to enforce regulations has been tough, and the lack of resources to develop control and eradication strategies. They have, through the work that USDA has done, decreased the prevalence of disease. They've assisted with the development of those regulations. the strengthened border security. And like I said, I see Sylvia in the back of the room, and she will be filling you in on more. The next thing I wanted to mention is regionalization and compartmentalization. As I've worked with producers, I think they feel that if we get an outbreak in the US, we can regionalize and our international trade will go on relatively uninterrupted. So just a little bit on definitions. Zoning and regionalization, are often used synonymously. There's a little bit of a difference we'll talk about, but both of those terms refer to a geographical area. So when you look at zoning versus regionalization, our competent authorities, our state vets, our USDA, will set up zones around an outbreak. We'll have a control zone, we'll have a surveillance zone, we'll have zones that are meant to manage the outbreak. And then when you look at regionalization, we may have a trading partner, and I'll pick on Japan just because they're one of our most important trading partners, that will say, okay, we will accept regions, but we don't want anything from, I'm going to pick on Iowa because I lived there for so long, we don't want anything from the whole state of Iowa if Iowa's had an outbreak, even though the control zone within Iowa may be 2 counties. And so there is a bit of a difference between regionalization and zoning, and it's something that's going to be difficult as we look at packing plants, and they need to figure out they're getting animals that are from outside a control zone, but can they manage that it might be a region that one of the trading partners doesn't want? So there will be a lot of difficulty or complexity, I guess is maybe the right word, of trying to figure that out. And then compartmentalization is a population of animals that have been raised and kept in a certain way so that even if they are within an area that's not free, that population can be represented as free. So Europeans have done zoning or regionalization, and they're using theirs pretty synonymously, where their regions are kept as control regions, but they're also regions that are the way they affect movement and trade. So it's really robust. They do a lot of testing. They do a lot of movement controls, meets WOA standards. They haven't been able to limit the spread of wild boar cases. And the thing that is now, to me, a challenge as we talk to producers is that it's been accepted by very few trading partners. So probably doing a more robust regionalization than the US would be able to do, because they have so much more veterinary infrastructure from their governments. And so it's a little discouraging when you look at international trade, but one of the things to remember is that it has allowed intra-EU trade to continue. So that, well, something in the red zone, which is where they have both domestic and wild pig outbreaks, may not be allowed to go throughout the EU. Something within the pink zone where they have wild boar outbreaks can move. And then there are blue areas here. I should have described that. The blue areas are surveillance or higher risk areas where they do increased surveillance. And these maps are updated very often. I mean, it's not like it takes months when they get a new outbreak to update these maps. And then there's this thing that WOA started about 3 years ago called a protection zone. And it's a free area where special controls, surveillance, et cetera, are in place, that if it were to be infected, it would not change the status of the adjoining free area that it's protecting. So you could almost think of some of these blue areas in Europe as protection zones. They're protecting the free areas. So when the DR went positive, the US decided we needed to put together a protection zone in Puerto Rico and the US Virgin Islands. Sylvia, how much of this are you going to talk about? Can I keep talking? Okay, I don't want to step on your presentation. Okay, so what USDA has done with the partners in Puerto Rico is do a significant surveillance and depopulation of wild pigs, and they've got significant other other protections in place. That protection zone has now been accepted by Australia, Canada, the European Union, for all that we send to the EU, Guatemala, Hong Kong for live swine only, New Zealand, Philippines, Singapore, United Kingdom, and Japan. So it is, this protection zone is the first one that had been put in place, and it has received fairly universal acceptance. And these are just a few pictures we took in Puerto Rico a couple years ago when we were down there. They've got this kind of interesting population of urban feral pigs that were urban wild pigs that are pot-bellied pigs that were pets. And when Hurricane Maria came around, they were turned loose, and there was lots of garbage, lots of fruit and vegetables to eat, and they have multiplied greatly. And you'll see the ferry landing, the dogs meeting them, the pre-clearance, so that at the airport they're checking baggage coming to the United States to make sure that product's not leaving Puerto Rico and coming to the US. Then we'll finish up with vaccination. And so vaccination, has been that kind of a hope that we would come up with vaccine that would be effective against ASF. And all of you know that ASF is a very complex virus, and it's big, and we're not well understood what the protective antigens are for it. So lately there's been really a very significant global concern over the genotype 1, genotype 2 recombinant virus that's been reported in China and now into Russia, which really adds urgency to the approval of the WOA standards on ASF vaccine. The rumor, perhaps belief, but not proved, is that ineffective or unapproved vaccines has driven that genotype 1, genotype 2 recombination. That does demonstrate the importance of matching field strain to vaccine virus. So making sure that there is coverage, that you're not vaccinating with a vaccine that is going to drive an outbreak rather than diminish an outbreak. And in countries like ours that are free trading countries where there's an objective to either trade or eradicate disease, DIVA is going to be really important. And as of yet, any of those vaccines that are out there do not have a DIVA. So a little bit about who's doing what, and then we'll open it up for questions. The vaccine that Vietnam approved was the first that's been commercially approved in the globe. It is it comes from a couple different isolates that they have acquired from USDA's Agricultural Research Service. And just heard a presentation from Vietnam last week up at the North American ASF conference that they've used 3.4 million doses, and they have stockpiled another 1.4 million doses. They've exported 300,000 doses to the Philippines, 5,000 doses to Nigeria, and I will let Sylvia tell you about the safety trial that's underway in the Dominican Republic. I am still very uncertain, and I've heard 3 presentations and asked the question every way I could think to ask on what the government control over this vaccine use is in Vietnam. It's been approved by their FDA, but my understanding is that government veterinarians, at least federal government veterinarians, don't necessarily control the distribution of the vaccine or actually administer the vaccine. But then I've been told that some of it's done by provincial or state veterinarians. And so I'm here to say that in my mind, there's some uncertainty over that. I asked the question again last week, and they told me that farmers could buy the vaccine. But I don't know where they buy it from and who has oversight over it. So any of you that have business or friends in Vietnam, I would love some clarity around that. They did state last week when we were there that they had one large producer that has vaccinated, of the premises they vaccinated, they used over 600,000 doses. The big thing was knowing that those premises were free of ASF when they vaccinated, and that none of those premises have broken with ASF post-vaccination, and that 93% of the vaccinated pigs had developed antibody. So they're happy with the efficacy, and they did say something like, again, this is an English translation, so it's difficult sometimes to get the clarity around meaning, but they said it was pretty safe. And so, again, I think they're in a situation where the use of vaccine is helping them limit the number of outbreaks and helping them preserve their pig industry. The Philippines, FDA has issued a conditional certificate of product registration for the vaccine. It's restricted to use only by the Department of Agriculture in the Philippines and for 2 years. And the vaccination will center in Batangas, where the disease has been resurgent lately. So this is my tribute to Scott D., where he'd do presentations and always have images from museums he's finished or visited in various areas. These images were all images I took off the coast of Batangas in a little town called Anilao, and it makes me want to get back underwater when I saw those pictures. So with that was kind of a whirlwind of what we've been hearing and the kind of the global response, and I'd be happy to take any questions or discussion. Thank you.
On your question of where other countries can say you can't come from this state and all that, how well regulated is that? And I'll give an example. We make a product that has poultry in it, and Minnesota, our company's based in Minnesota, was one of those taken, you can't have poultry products from Minnesota. However, it's because of our address, even though the poultry meal came from Arkansas and the product was produced in Iowa, we can't produce it because the way they look at it is the address of the company there. As you look at the health certificates, how good of a system does our government have in helping to certify those to get to that level of granularity?
Great question, and it's one of the reasons NPPC has been really working on mandatory identification, mandatory traceability, movement reporting. The Meat Institute, which is the trade association for the pork packers, are going to be the people who are going to have to certify on the health certificate that no animals in this consignment came from those states or those countries. I was with a Japanese visit last fall that was talking about it, and they had concerns. Let's say you were at a packing plant in Nebraska, and they're sending product to Japan, and they don't want anything from Iowa. And the packing plant could say, all of the meat from this consignment came from animals that were not from Iowa. But even if there were animals from Iowa that came into the plant, they weren't going to be accepting of that. So it is going to have a lot of complexity. Are we going to have export-only plants that take animals from only certain country or certain counties or states? And then just because Japan doesn't want Iowa, it might mean that Chile might not want anything from the Midwest, and so not each one of our trading partners is going to accept the same regions. And so for us to think it could be easy to start up trade at post-regionalization is pretty naive.
What about if you go to further processing? So if it's on another location?
Yep, and that's going to make it even more complex. And so we're pretty lucky in that we send a lot of primals, a lot of offals, not a lot of further processed product. We do send some, but it's once you start mixing and mingling, it makes it even harder.
Just, and those are kind of things that you should think about when in peace times, right?
Yes.
So it's going to be very difficult after, if we ever get one outbreak. We hope we don't, but.
Thank you very much. Hi, Liz. I'm Sarah Mikesell with the Pig Site, and I get all those WOA emails that you get, right? And one of the things I wanted to ask you about is I see a lot from the Ukraine and Russia. Do you have any kind of update on where they're at and what's going on there? And if we're seeing more of a push, I guess, into Europe from some of that that's going on there?
Yep, we had a couple presentations last week from Europe, and you see a steady push across Europe. It's been fairly slow when it's wild boar moving, and then you get these jumps, which they feel is somebody either, taking meat that's been contaminated and dropping a sandwich and a wild animal getting it or whatever. And so there are those human jumps that they talk about. When you get to the Ukraine and Russia, it's kind of like Haiti. They've got about 800 more important things to worry about than African swine fever. And so while Ukraine is very much an agricultural powerhouse, whether they have the infrastructure to worry about control of ASF would be difficult. And Russia has been surprisingly transparent about their ASF outbreaks. But again, they've done a good job in certain cases of getting rid of it. And other cases, it continues. And I'm not sure, and maybe somebody in the room would have more information about how strongly Russia is trying to control it.